Stephanie Arell, and today I'm going to talk to you briefly about what Judith Kerman calls the trauma dialectic. I think it's important because it helps to articulate the dynamics inherent in facing, dealing with, confronting, and working with trauma at multiple levels. So that's one of the reasons why I think it's useful. It helps us understand what's happening in and around trauma related to social, individual, and familial dynamics. All right, so what does it mean? First of all, definition. Judith Kerman calls this the dialectic around the will to proclaim the trauma aloud and the will to deny it. An easy way to envision this has to do with thinking about mass trauma or global traumas. I will use as an example Bosnia. So for those of you who are younger, probably you don't either know about or have a recollection of the war in Bosnia. The war in Bosnia is often termed otherwise than a war because it was a genocide. David Reef, who was the son of Susan Sontag, a famous writer who I love, he calls this Bosnian genocide the slaughter instead of calling it a war. What happened was in the 90s, complex military and social issues between Bosnia and Serbia blew up. The Serbians encircled Sarajevo and enacted a genocide and a terror regime against Bosnia for an extended period of time, for years. There's lots written on this, but what I want to get to is the aftermath. Even now, 20 plus years later, there's this dynamic inherent around the trauma of this genocide where there are political regimes and struggles in that dynamic of wanting to proclaim, this is what happened here, this is what happened in Bosnia, this is what happened to the people in Sarajevo and Srebrenica, versus military political figures in Bosnia who want to say, no, that didn't happen, or it wasn't as bad, or no, we weren't partaking, or no, this isn't how it went. So this kind of culture of denial around the phenomenon. You can look it up online, it'll come up like this, where you have these two tensions or these two poles of proclamation and denial. I'm thinking in my mind, actually, when I did some interviews for my book on Bearing Witness, that I talked to one girl who's actually Serbian. Just in any political conflict, there are going to be people on both sides who are not wanting to fight each other or hurt each other, or conversely thinking about the Serbians attacking the Bosnians. Or even if you think about Russia and the Ukraine, this does not mean that all of Russia is attacking the Ukraine. These are political systems and people who really want power that are creating the conflict. Again, much deeper than that, but I don't want to overgeneralize that we're talking about everybody that's part of these populations contesting each other. Serbian girl that I interviewed who's very involved in social justice and civil rights issues actually globally. She was telling me that she had some conflicts. This is articulated a little bit more in my book during some of the movements that they did in terms of proclaiming the facts of the Bosnian War and seeing war criminals released from prison because they had served their time and then going back and living with them in the same apartment building. That is another level of thinking about the occurrence of trauma and this dynamic between, hey, this happened to me, but now I have to live with you. There's a level of kind of a covering over in order to tolerate that experience. Okay, so hopefully that gives you a little bit of idea of what it means to say proclaim aloud and deny on a global level or on a intense political social level. In families, this discourse or dialectic gets mobilized particularly strongly around maintaining social appearances. So the example I'll use, and I alert you to the fact that what I'm about to say to this might be a little bit disturbing. If you have a family where, say that the teenage daughter was sexually assaulted by somebody either well known in the community or say a college student where the family knows the person or doesn't know the person, but that the family says, we'll deal with this internally, we'll take you to a therapist, but we're not going to press charges, or we're not going to hold the other party accountable, we're just going to let this be. That is another way that the dialectic operates. So the family asks the person who's endured the trauma to tolerate a certain level of denial by not addressing or proclaiming the trauma aloud. So I'm not going to address, I'm not going to hold accountable. Instead, I'm just going to internalize, keep this within the family circle. So this is particularly insidious, I think, in relationship to what it means to ask people to be silent, right? To endure, to not talk about, to not proclaim, to not address, to not acknowledge when harm is done to them, to family members, to friends. So it's important to think about, because it locates us in a trauma dialectic. And I think one of the dangers in that is that it inhibits really processing through the trauma. Now, there is an element of thinking about what it looks like to proclaim aloud, and having done a lot of work within the field of memory and in memorial museums, I think that museums oftentimes are on the side of proclamation, but there is a certain way in which proclamation then has stakes within how we represent historical narratives, for instance. So I'm not idealizing any one role. It's worth thinking about, though, what does it mean to locate yourself within that dialectic, and potentially, if we're going back and forth between proclamation and denial, are we processing out of, are we getting out of the dynamic? Something to think about. Now, on an individual level, the easiest way to think about this dialectic is in the phenomenon of dissociation or in minimization. So I'll give you two examples. And there are more ways to think about it than this, but here are two. When someone is, say, in a conversation with another person, and you're talking about your past, you're getting to know each other, and someone shares a traumatic narrative, and then the other person has this experience of, oh, my story's not as bad. That is the beginning of the operation of the trauma dialectic of denial. So this isn't as bad, I don't need to talk about it, I don't need to process it. Or maybe somebody goes into therapy, and when they start to get to the real meat of the issue, they sort of back up because the fear of, being broken apart again by a traumatic narrative surfaces and feels like it's going to make a big impact. And so then there's this level of repression, or, well, it's not that bad, I don't really need to deal with it, I'm just going to keep it inside, I'm just going to be it internal. We might be able to consider the polar opposite of that trauma bonding. Oh, look, this is my story, let's connect, let's proclaim it aloud. So I don't know that either end is where we want to be. It's something to think about, though. I do think that there's something really, really important about acknowledging when something has happened to you that feels like betrayal, that feels like trauma, that feels like an injustice, that is an experience that deregulates you or creates some sense of terror, helplessness. Very, very important to acknowledge. Getting into the denial phase of repressing or discounting or minimizing your own experience is not helpful for processing or going through the process of recovery. Another way that this happens, this dialectic, is in the physiological enactment of dissociation. If there's a freeze response in relationship to material that has to do with traumatic past, or which triggers some entrance of past memory into the present, and someone shuts down completely, that's a way of being within that dialectic on a more physiological or biological level. Sometimes when people dissociate in real time, when the event is not occurring, one of the things they'll do is they'll look away, they'll look out a window, and they won't quite be present. Sometimes this can happen at exceeding rates related to when somebody is in a situation that feels high stress, and then they actually lose gaps in time where they can't remember what happened for a certain amount of time. That's the same mechanism of this dialectic. Trauma really does make an impact on all of these different levels within social institutions, within political bodies or nations, within families, and within our own individual bodies in ways that we can understand related to the trauma dialectic, which again is the will to proclaim a trauma aloud and the will to deny it, and these two poles that kind of pull on each other in our process of recovery.